A shocking incident of discrimination turned a routine flight into a nightmare when a flight attendant callously discarded a black teenager's vital medication, setting off a chain of events that no one aboard could have anticipated. The father's response was swift and decisive, bringing the entire aircraft to a standstill in a powerful stand against injustice that would soon make headlines across the country. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The January sky hung low over JFK Airport, a dismal grey blanket that matched 16-year-old Sarah Johnson's mood as she settled into her first-class seat. She hadn't wanted to fly alone, but her father, Michael Johnson, was still completing his captain's shift in Denver. The familiar tightness began in her chest, not unusual when her anxiety flared, prompting her to reach for the inhaler tucked in her jacket pocket. Sarah had lived with asthma since childhood, the small blue device as much a part of her daily routine as brushing her teeth. As she prepared to take a puff, Linda Brown approached with the determined stride of someone about to enforce rules. "What do you think you're doing?" Linda's voice cut through the pre-flight ambience. Several passengers looked up from their magazines and devices. "It's my inhaler," Sarah explained, her voice already thinning as her airways constricted. "I need it for my asthma." Linda's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "That's not on your passenger profile. Looks like contraband to me." Without warning, she snatched the medical device from Sarah's hands. "Please," Sarah gasped, feeling the familiar panic rising. "I can't breathe without it." The flight attendant glanced at her seating chart, noting the discrepancy that had placed Sarah in first class despite her reservation showing coach. This inconsistency seemed to harden her resolve. "Rules are rules," Linda stated firmly, dropping the inhaler into a trash bin with a metallic clang that seemed to echo through the entire cabin. Sarah's lungs burned as she struggled for air. Her fingers clutched the armrests, knuckles whitening. An elderly man across the aisle leaned forward with concern etched on his face. Dr. David Smith, though Sarah didn't know him yet. "That young lady needs medical attention," he called out, his retired physician's instincts kicking in immediately. The emergency lights flickered momentarily, a routine system check that felt ominously timed. Passengers exchanged worried glances as Sarah's breathing became more labored, each gasp audible in the suddenly quiet cabin. A woman in business attire 2 rows ahead turned around, her own memories of asthma attacks making her instantly sympathetic. Angela Martin, though off duty, recognized the symptoms immediately. "She needs that inhaler back," Angela said, her voice carrying the weight of personal experience. But Linda had already moved toward the front of the plane, the trash bin now in the galley. Sarah's vision began to blur at the edges, dark spots dancing before her eyes as oxygen became precious. The cabin fell into an uncomfortable hush, the only sounds the ambient hum of the engines and Sarah's increasingly desperate attempts to breathe. In that moment of suspended animation, no one yet realized how this single act would cascade into a national controversy, or that somewhere in the cabin, a journalism intern named Emily Adis had just pressed record on her phone. Emily Davis clutched her smartphone tighter as the scene unfolded before her. The 23-year-old journalism intern had been reviewing notes for her first major assignment in California when the commotion erupted. From her seat directly behind Sarah Johnson, Emily had a perfect view of the confrontation, too perfect to ignore. Without thinking, she activated her phone's camera and began recording. The lens captured Linda Brown's dismissive flick of the wrist as she tossed the inhaler into the trash bin. It documented Sarah's widening eyes, her hands clutching at her throat, her desperate attempts to communicate the severity of what had just happened. "You can't just take someone's medicine," a passenger shouted from across the aisle. The flight attendant straightened her uniform. "I have a responsibility to confiscate unauthorized items," Linda replied, her voice carrying a certainty that seemed to waver only slightly as Sarah's breathing became more labored. Emily's journalistic instincts took over. She switched to livestream mode, her trembling thumb hitting the broadcast button. The feed connected instantly, beaming the unfolding crisis to her modest following of journalism school classmates and mentors. "I'm on flight 213, she whispered into the microphone. "A flight attendant just threw away a teenage girl's asthma inhaler. She can't breathe." Within minutes, the viewer count jumped from 12 to over 3,000. Comments flooded in, demanding the airline's name, the flight number, the attendant's identity. The live stream captured every moment. Dr. David Smith rushing from his seat near the back of the plane, the hushed arguments between crew members, and most devastatingly, Sarah's silent tears as she struggled for air. "This is medical discrimination," typed one viewer. Another added, "Someone needs to be fired." Emily hadn't intended to become part of the story, but her split-second decision to document had transformed a private tragedy into a public reckoning. Her broadcast revealed not just Linda's snap judgment mistaking a life-saving medical device for contraband, but exposed the dangerous speed with which suspicion could override compassion. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, the video had been shared over 20,000 times. News outlets were calling Emily's phone, which she'd silenced as per flight regulations. Angela Martin, summoned to the cabin by frantic crew members, stared at the small screen a passenger held up, showing the viral clip already playing on a national morning show. "We have a situation," the supervisor whispered to the captain, unaware that across the country, Michael Johnson was just receiving the first of many alerts about his daughter. The world was suddenly watching, and the stakes had never been higher. News of the incident spread like wildfire across social media platforms. For Michael Johnson, however, this wasn't just another viral outrage. It was his daughter fighting for breath thousands of feet above ground. The respected airline captain was just completing his Denver layover when his phone erupted with notifications. His heart nearly stopped as he watched the shaky footage of Sarah gasping for air after Linda Brown had discarded her life-saving medication. Michael's hands trembled as he piloted his scheduled flight back to JFK, his mind torn between professional duty and parental terror. Every minute in the cockpit felt like torture as he imagined his 16-year-old daughter struggling without her inhaler. The father maintained his composure somehow, safely landing his aircraft while internally crafting a plan of action. The moment the wheels touched down in New York, he switched from captain to father. Michael rushed through his post-flight checks with mechanical efficiency, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. His co-pilot noticed the unusual tension, but knew better than to ask questions when he saw the haunted look in his colleague's eyes. Still in his full captain's uniform, 4 gold stripes gleaming on each sleeve, he strode purposefully through the terminal. Airport staff recognized the veteran pilot immediately, nodding respectfully as he passed. The uniform carried authority, and Michael intended to use every ounce of it to help his daughter. "Sarah's flight is still at the gate," he muttered to himself, checking the departure board. His resolve hardened with each step toward the operations center. Years of calm decision-making in aviation emergencies had prepared him for this moment, though he'd never imagined fighting for his child's right to breathe would be part of his career. Inside the operations hub, Michael leveraged his 20-year reputation and network of connections. "This is Captain Johnson," he announced, voice steady despite his internal turmoil. "I need Flight 213 held at the gate immediately. My daughter's medical device was confiscated by your crew." The operations manager recognized the gravity in his tone. When Michael explained the situation, how a flight attendant had thrown away Sarah's inhaler mistaking it for contraband, silence fell across the room. "I want that aircraft grounded until my daughter's inhaler is returned or replaced," he demanded, his authority unquestioned. "And I want the incident documented and addressed." Word spread quickly through the terminal. Passengers already seated on Sarah's flight watched in confusion as ground crew suddenly appeared, preventing departure. The captain's unprecedented action sent shockwaves through the airline's hierarchy. No one had ever seen a pilot use his position to ground another aircraft, especially not for a personal matter. But for Michael, nothing was more personal than his child's ability to breathe. He would move mountains, or in this case, stop airplanes to protect her. Inside the operations office at JFK Airport, Angela Martin clutched the edge of her desk, the weight of the unfolding crisis pressing down on her shoulders. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her face as she stared at the incident report. Behind her professional demeanor, memories flooded back, nights spent gasping for air as a child, the panic that only fellow asthmatics truly understand. "This isn't just about protocol," Angela whispered, more to herself than to the airline staff gathered around her. She'd made a promise years ago, after a particularly severe attack left her hospitalized. She would never dismiss another person's struggle to breathe. The supervisor glanced at the security footage playing on her monitor. Sarah Johnson's terrified expression was unmistakable as Linda removed the inhaler. Angela recognized that look, the primal fear when your next breath isn't guaranteed. Captain Johnson is within his rights to demand action, said Dr. David Smith, who stood in the corner of the cramped office. The retired physician had boarded the flight for a medical conference, but now found himself at the center of an escalating situation. I treated Sarah last year during a routine physical. Her asthma is severe and potentially life-threatening without medication. Angela nodded, remembering her own medical file thick with emergency room visits and specialist consultations. But grounding an entire aircraft? The company will face far worse if this girl suffers an attack mid-flight, Smith interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority of decades in public hospitals. I've seen what happens when protocol trumps common sense. Through the office window, Angela could see Michael Johnson in his captain's uniform, standing firm at the gate. The father's determination was palpable even from a distance. We have 400 passengers waiting, argued the operations manager, tapping his watch impatiently. This is becoming a PR nightmare. It's already a PR nightmare, Angela replied, pointing to her phone where Emily Davis's livestream had already garnered thousands of views, and it's about to become a medical emergency if we don't act. She closed her eyes briefly, feeling the familiar tightness in her own chest. Not an attack, but the phantom memory of one. When she opened them again, her decision was made. Find that inhaler, she ordered, straightening her shoulders. Check the trash bins, check Linda's pockets if you have to, and get a medical kit to Sarah immediately. Dr. Smith gave her an approving nod as the staff rushed to comply. You're doing the right thing, he said quietly. I know, Angela replied, watching Captain Johnson through the window. Because 15 years ago, I was Sarah, and nobody stood up for me. March brought an unexpected twist to Sarah Johnson's already complicated life. A technical glitch in the airline's reservation system had erroneously assigned her to coach, despite her first-class ticket. This seemingly minor error would prove catastrophic when combined with the prejudices lurking beneath the surface of flight attendant Linda Brown's professional demeanor. The mix-up was discovered in the cockpit, just moments before departure. The captain had been reviewing the passenger manifest when he noticed the discrepancy. Sarah had been issued a first-class boarding pass, but was listed in the system as a coach passenger. The oversight was quickly corrected digitally, but the updated information hadn't reached all crew members. When 16-year-old Sarah took her rightful seat in first class, Linda immediately took note. The flight attendant's eyes narrowed as she watched the teenager settle in, her asthma inhaler visible as she placed it in the seat pocket. Something about the young black girl in the premium cabin triggered an unconscious bias in Linda that she herself would later struggle to acknowledge. Excuse me, Linda approached with forced politeness, tablet in hand. I need to verify your seating assignment. Sarah produced her boarding pass, but the attendant glanced at her device, where the outdated information still showed. The system says you're assigned to seat 23C, she stated firmly. There must be a mistake, Sarah replied, anxiety already tightening her chest. My father always books first class because of my medical condition. The mention of a medical condition only deepened Linda's suspicion. In her 15 years of service, she'd encountered passengers attempting to smuggle illegal substances aboard. The inhaler, a standard medical device to anyone familiar with asthma, registered in her mind as potential contraband. What's that in your seat pocket? Linda questioned, her tone shifting from professional to accusatory. My inhaler. I have asthma, Sarah explained, feeling the familiar tightness that signaled an oncoming attack. The flight attendant's misplaced confidence in the flawless seating chart, combined with her unexamined prejudice about who belonged in first class, led to her next fateful decision. When Sarah reached for her inhaler as her breathing became labored, Linda swiftly confiscated it. I'll need to verify this with the captain, she announced, already convinced she'd caught a teenager attempting to transport drugs. That single moment, born from a computer error and nurtured by bias, would soon cascade into a national controversy that none of them could have anticipated. The inhaler, tossed carelessly into a trash bin, would become a symbol of injustice that would change airline policy forever. By May, the hashtag #NeedLetSarahBreathe had transformed from a simple social media trend into a full-blown movement. Civil rights organizations joined forces with disability advocacy groups, creating an unlikely but powerful alliance. The campaign's reach extended far beyond Sarah Johnson's personal ordeal, becoming a rallying cry for thousands who had faced similar discrimination. "Federal law is crystal clear on this," declared the National Disability Rights Network in a widely shared statement. Medical devices are protected under the Air Carrier Access Act. Their infographics detailing passengers' rights were reshared over 50,000 times in a single weekend. These posts specifically highlighted the regulations that Linda Brown had violated when she discarded the teenager's inhaler. Meanwhile, Sarah had become the reluctant face of a national conversation about invisible disability. Meanwhile, Angela recruited volunteers from local asthma support groups to test the system under controlled conditions. Emily Davis, whose video had initially brought attention to Sarah's plight, covered the story for her now regular column. "Technology alone can't solve discrimination," she wrote, "but when properly implemented, it can help prevent tragic mistakes." Sarah herself participated in the testing phase, traveling to the airline's technical center with her inhaler securely in hand. Now 17, she showed remarkable composure as engineers monitored her interactions with the system. "I need to know this works," she told them. "Not just for me, but for everyone who might board a plane feeling scared and vulnerable." By month's end, the revised MedAlert system passed its final tests. But the incident had taken its toll. Public confidence wavered, and the airline's stock price reflected investors' concerns. The road ahead remained challenging, but the team's resolve had only strengthened through adversity. The crisp November air in Washington, D.C. carried a sense of possibility as Sarah Johnson stepped onto the marble steps of the Capitol building. Her invitation to the National Accessibility Forum had arrived 3 weeks earlier, an embossed envelope bearing the airline's logo, the culmination of careful outreach by their public relations team following months of negative press. Sarah clutched her inhaler tightly in her pocket, a habit she'd developed since that January morning. The device was now adorned with a prototype of the biometric identification band Dr. David Smith had helped design. The physician had called her the night before with encouraging news about implementation timelines and had reminded her to breathe deeply before speaking. "Remember your talking points," Michael Johnson whispered, straightening his tie. Her father had taken personal leave to accompany her, his captain's uniform exchanged for a charcoal suit that seemed to weigh on his shoulders. The guilt still haunted his eyes, though Sarah had told him countless times that his actions had sparked necessary change. Inside the Grand Hall, lawmakers and industry representatives mingled beneath crystal chandeliers. Senator Eleanor Wilson, chair of the Transportation Committee, approached with an outstretched hand. "Your story moved many of us to action," the senator said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had fought similar battles decades earlier. "We're drafting legislation that would standardize medical device protocols across all carriers." Sarah nodded, finding her voice. "Will it include training requirements?" The flight attendant didn't recognize my inhaler as medical equipment. The senator gestured toward a group of staffers furiously taking notes. "We're calling it the Medical Access in Transit Act. Your experience highlighted gaps that have existed for years." Throughout the day, Sarah met with 16 different representatives, each conversation reinforcing what Angela Martin had told her during their last video call. Systems only change when faces attach to statistics. By evening, as the forum concluded with promises of bipartisan support, Sarah stood at the window overlooking the National Mall. For the first time since that terrifying flight, she felt something beyond anger or determination. She felt "Your grandmother would be so proud," Michael said, joining her at the window. "She always said one voice could change everything." Sarah smiled, thinking of the memorial in Los Angeles and how far they'd come. The legislation wouldn't erase what happened to her, but it might prevent another 16-year-old from having to fight for breath at 30,000 feet. As they left the building, Emily Davis, now a full-time reporter covering disability rights, caught them on the steps for a brief interview. Sarah spoke with newfound confidence about a future where medical necessity would never again be mistaken for contraband. December brought with it a crisp chill and a sense of closure for Sarah Johnson. After months of advocacy, legal battles, and countless meetings, the airline finally launched its MedAlert application, a comprehensive digital system fully integrated with passenger profiles that would flag medical necessities to flight crews before boarding. Sarah, still only 16, found herself in the unexpected position of becoming the public face of the initiative. "We're ensuring no passenger ever has to fight for their right to life-saving medication again," she explained during the press conference, her voice steady despite the flashing cameras. Michael Johnson stood at the back of the room, his captain's uniform replaced by a simple suit, pride evident in his eyes as he watched his daughter transform personal trauma into meaningful change. The journey to this moment had been grueling. Sarah had spent countless late nights hunched over her laptop, poring through dense regulatory documents that most teenagers would never encounter. Virtual meetings with airline executives, disability advocates, and medical professionals had become a regular part of her routine, often stretching well past midnight. Dr. David Smith had become a fixture in these discussions, lending his medical expertise to the technical aspects of the application. "What impresses me most," he confided to Angela Martin during a break between meetings, "is how she's channeled her fear into something constructive." Angela nodded in agreement. Having lived with asthma herself, the supervisor understood the significance of what they were building. The system they'd created would recognize everything from inhalers to EpiPens, insulin pumps to portable oxygen concentrators, all documented during check-in and flagged for cabin crew awareness. The app's interface was sleek yet simple, designed with input from Sarah herself. Each medical device would be photographed during check-in, creating a visual reference for flight attendants like Linda Brown, whose hasty judgment had sparked this entire movement. "I never wanted to become an advocate," Sarah admitted during a quiet moment with Emily Davis, who had continued documenting the story for her now permanent position at the news outlet. "But if my experience prevents even one person from going through what I did, it's worth it." By mid-December, Sarah had earned an unofficial title, Junior Health Policy Advocate. Schools across the country began inviting her to speak, and 3 major airlines had already expressed interest in adopting similar protocols. As the year drew to a close, Sarah stood in her bedroom in New York, fingering the new medical ID bracelet that would connect to the airline's system. The device represented more than just technology. It was tangible proof that sometimes, from the darkest moments come the brightest innovations. Despite becoming the face of a national movement, Sarah Johnson's daily life at school remained a battleground. The 16-year-old would often catch fragments of whispered conversations that abruptly ceased when she approached. "There she is, the inhaler girl," someone would mutter, reducing her entire identity to a single traumatic incident. Even her closest friends sometimes kept their distance, uncomfortable with the media attention that occasionally followed Sarah to school events. When local reporters appeared at a track meet, Jessica, her running partner since 7th grade, deliberately chose a different warm-up area. "I just don't want to be in any videos," she explained later, avoiding Sarah's eyes. The isolation stung worse than the original humiliation. Sarah would sometimes retreat to the bathroom between classes, clutching her new inhaler now decorated with advocacy stickers and fighting back tears. Each shallow breath reminded her of those terrifying moments on Flight 213, when Linda Brown had callously discarded her lifeline. Dr. David Smith noticed the psychological toll during Sarah's follow-up appointment. "The body remembers trauma," he explained gently, "especially when it involves something as fundamental as breathing." The physician recommended a support group for teens with chronic conditions, creating yet another unexpected connection in Sarah's expanding network. At home, Sarah overheard her father on the phone with airline colleagues, his voice tight with controlled anger. Michael Johnson had become fiercely protective, sometimes to the point of suffocation. "Dad, I can handle going to the mall alone," she'd insist, though the truth was more complicated. Every public space now felt potentially hostile, every stranger a possible critic, or worse, someone who might recognize her from the viral video. Yet for every setback, Sarah found new results. When Angela Martin invited her to speak at a staff training session, the teenager initially froze at the podium. But seeing the supervisor, who shared her condition, nodding encouragingly from the front row gave her strength. Sarah's voice grew steadier as she described not just what happened, but what should have happened. My inhaler wasn't contraband, it was my right to breathe, she told the silent room of airline employees. And your passengers shouldn't have to choose between dignity and survival. Her words resonated beyond that training room. Other teenagers with medical conditions began reaching out through social media, sharing their own stories of discrimination and fear. What had started as one girl's nightmare was evolving into a movement fragile but growing, fueled by the fierce determination that can only come from knowing exactly what's at stake. Michael Johnson sat alone in his dimly lit kitchen, nursing a cold cup of coffee as rain pattered against the windows. 6 months had passed since that fateful January morning, yet the memory remained razor-sharp. Each night he found himself reliving those terrible moments, his daughter struggling for breath 30,000 feet above ground while he stood helplessly on another tarmac, completely unaware. The airline captain ran his fingers through his graying hair, exhaustion etched into the lines of his face. He had always prided himself on being Sarah's protector, yet when she needed him most he had been absent. The thought of what might have happened if Dr. David Smith hadn't been on that flight sent chills down his spine. I should have been there, he whispered to the empty room. His phone buzzed with another message of support, this time from a fellow pilot who had implemented the new medical alert protocols on his own flights. Michael had received hundreds of such messages since the incident. Colleagues from across the country had rallied behind his decision to ground the aircraft, many sharing stories of their own children with medical conditions. The neighborhood had shown up too. Miss Chen from next door had organized meal deliveries during the weeks when press camped outside their home. The Rodriguez family had driven Sarah to therapy appointments when Michael's flight schedule couldn't be adjusted. Even strangers sent letters describing how the incident had inspired them to advocate for loved ones with invisible disabilities. Michael scrolled through his email, pausing at a message from Angela Martin. The supervisor had become an unexpected ally, her own experience with asthma creating a bridge of understanding. Her latest update detailed improvements to crew training that would prevent another attendant from making Linda Brown's devastating mistake. He glanced at the framed photo on his refrigerator. Sarah standing confidently at the Washington Forum, addressing lawmakers with poise that belied her 16 years. Despite everything, his daughter had transformed trauma into purpose. The pride he felt warred constantly with the guilt that such transformation had come at such a terrible cost. The captain's uniform hanging by the door caught his eye. Tomorrow he would return to the cockpit, where colleagues no longer saw him simply as Captain Johnson, but as the man who had dared to challenge an entire system for his child. His stand on that tarmac had rippled outward, touching policies, procedures, and people he would never meet. Perhaps that was the unexpected gift hidden within their ordeal, the knowledge that sometimes a single act of parental protection could cascade into change far beyond one family, one flight, or one frightening moment when breathing itself became a privilege rather than a right. Angela Martin stood by the window in the airline's break room, watching planes taxi across the tarmac. 6 months after the incident with Sarah Johnson, she still felt the weight of that day pressing on her chest, not unlike the asthma attack she had hidden from colleagues for 15 years. The memory of Sarah's terrified face mirrored her own childhood experiences. Angela had spent decades downplaying her condition, carrying her inhaler in unmarked pouches and slipping away to use it in bathroom stalls. She had perfected the art of suffering in silence, convinced that revealing her vulnerability would undermine her authority. "You can't change policy if you're not willing to be honest," Dr. David Smith had told her during one of their many conversations following the incident. His words had lingered, challenging her carefully constructed facade. One Tuesday morning during a routine staff meeting, Angela made a decision. As 20 airline employees sat reviewing safety protocols, she placed her inhaler on the conference table. "I have severe asthma," she announced, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I've hidden it for 15 years because I feared judgment. But after what happened to Sarah, I realize my silence has been part of the problem." The room fell quiet. Then, to her surprise, the maintenance supervisor pulled out his own medication. "Epilepsy," he said simply. A flight attendant mentioned her fibromyalgia. A baggage handler spoke of his diabetes. By meeting's end, Invisible Wings was born, an employee support group for those with chronic conditions. What began as 8 people sharing stories in the break room expanded to over 100 members across 3 airport hubs. Angela worked tirelessly, often staying late to draft proposals for workplace accommodations. She collaborated with human resources to revise sick leave policies and emergency protocol. Her office became an unofficial safe space where employees could discuss health concerns without fear of repercussion. Were transportation professionals with medical conditions, what medical conditions working in transportation, became her rallying cry. The supervisor found unexpected allies in Michael Johnson and Dr. Smith, who offered guidance on implementing medical awareness training. Even Emily Davis contributed, producing a short documentary about invisible disabilities that became mandatory viewing during employee orientation. For Angela, the most profound change was personal. The inhaler she had once hidden now sat openly on her desk, a small plastic reminder that vulnerability could be a source of strength rather than weakness. Sometimes, she told a group of new hires, it takes someone else's courage to find your own. She thought of Sarah, the teenager whose struggle had inadvertently launched a movement within the company, breaking decades of silence and shame. As the 1-year anniversary of the infamous flight approached, Sarah Johnson received an unexpected invitation in her email. The Los Angeles Women's Leadership Coalition, a respected organization of retired professionals, wanted her to address their annual summit. The teenager hesitated, her finger hovering over the keyboard before finally typing her acceptance. The grand ballroom of the Westside Community Center buzzed with anticipation as Sarah took the stage. Sarah had started as a terrified teenager gasping for air on Flight 213. She ended the year as an advocate, an inspiration, and a testament to the strength that comes from standing up, again and again, even when the world tries to keep you grounded. Outside, the California sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The med alert system still needed refinements, bias training for airline staff remained incomplete, and Sarah's own healing journey continued. But tonight, surrounded by allies both planned and accidental, she allowed herself to simply breathe. For the first time since that cold January morning, the air filled her lungs completely, without resistance, without fear. And in that breath, Sarah found her power.